Meshech Chochma for Parshas Vaeira. Let's open up to Perek Vav of Sefer Shmos, Pasuk Yud Gimel. And a lot of what we're skipping here is about the Daled Lashonos Shel Geula, which we spoke about at great length last year. Vaitzavem el Bnei Yisrael, v'el Paro melech Mitzrayim lotzias Bnei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim. Now, all the Mefarshim grapple with the problem, Vaitzavem el Bnei Yisrael. We understand the Sefer of the Pasuk, and the Tzivui to Paro was Lahotzias Bnei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim. But what is the Reisha referring to? There doesn't seem to be any substance to this Tzivui that's given to Bnei Yisrael. And Rabbi Simcha, based on a medrash elsewhere in Parshas Naso, comes up with a pretty radical pshat. And when I first read this, I immediately had, what should I say, inhibitions or second thoughts about accepting this. And the thesis, as we'll see, of Rabbi Simcha is that not only were the Mitzrim Meshabed B'nai Yisrael, but even B'nai Yisrael within themselves were Meshabed one to the other. And specifically, there were three Shvatim that were Meshabed other Jews that were purchased as Avadim from the Mitzrim. And when I first read this, you can imagine I recoiled. I mean, it didn't make any sense to me that the Jewish people were responsible for enslaving other Jews, and they had to be commanded to free their slaves. Yitached, he says, Ki gam az b'Mitzrayim hayu gdolei ha'uma. They were the greats of the Jewish people. I guess you'd call them the elite. Asher hayu sarim, and they were noblemen, nichbadim, v'efratim. Efratim means aristocrats. V'hem hayu mishabdim es b'nei Yisrael avodim. So amongst the Jewish people, there was a hierarchy, and there were those Jews who were noblemen and aristocrats on the higher end of the pyramid, and they enslaved other Jews. Shemachma mitzrim lahem, they purchased them from the Mitzrim. V'ulai, and you'll ask me, can you identify these Sarim Nichbadim that were Meshabed B'nai Yisrael? I would suggest, as Rabbi Simcha, they were the Shlosha Shvatim, Ruven, Shimon, Levi. And here, the Meshech Chochma wants to address two questions. First of all, how do I prove to you that these three Shvatim out of the 12 had a special status? And secondly, even if I succeed in proving to you, based on a medrash in Parshas Naso, that these three Shvatim were in a special category of their own, but nevertheless, why were they given, so to speak, within the perspective, the constellation of divine providence, the special opportunity that within the exile and the slavery of Mitzrayim, instead of being slaves like the rest of the Jewish people, they were free from being slaves, and on the contrary, they hired, Jewish slaves. So first, to answer the question, how do we prove that these three Shvatim had a special status? He tells you to look in Medrash Naso. And the Medrash Naso says that Ruvain v'Shimon v'Levi hinhigu Srara b'Mitzrayim. Srara means that they lorded over the other Jews in Mitzrayim. And Mace Ruvain, if a member of the Shevet of Ruvain would die, he would pass on his Srara to a member of Shimon. And if a member of Shevet Shimon would die, he would pass over his Srara, his lordship, if you will, to a member of Shevet Levi. And it seems clear from the Medrash that these three Shvatim had the position of Srara. They were officers, and whatever control they had, they would pass it back and forth amongst these three Shvatim. And Rabbi Simcha, at this point, wants to give some, shall we say, rationale to this premise of the Medrash, and see if perhaps the three Shvatim were, in a sense, given compensation and special treatment from above because of some, shall we say, inferiority. And Hashem was sort of balancing the negative with a positive. How so? He says, Lo notlu nachla ba'aretz. First of all, we'll talk about Shevet Levi. Shevet Levi did not receive a portion in the land of Israel when Yoshua conquered the land and divided it up. And so Shevet Levi was certainly out of the category and the constellation of the other Shvatim, and therefore they were not enslaved in Mitzrayim. What about Reuven? Well, Reuven got the raw end of the deal, if you will. Shalom notal chelik ela be'ever Yarden. He never crossed the Jordan to inherit the land. And what about Shimon? And Yaakov Avinu, says the Ramban, when he blessed Shimon, at the end of Parshas Vayechi Achalkeim b'Yaakov, that Shimon was spread out in the land of Israel. Says the Ramban, he didn't get a special territory that was designated exclusively for him, but rather Shimon was nivla, he was sort of absorbed into the area of Shevet Nachlas Yehuda. So here's three Shvatim that did not inherit an exclusive portion of the land of Israel. Not Levi, not Reuven, who was an Ever Yarden, and not Shimon, who was a Chalkein b'Yisrael. And therefore, they were given sort of, if you will, quid pro quo compensation, and they were given granted Srara. Umehem ayu b'nei chorim harbe v'usarim. It sounds like the majority of these three Shvatim were free of the slavery, the oppression of the Mitzrim, and they were even given special status as Sorim. And how did that express itself? They would be Meshabed Klal Yisrael because the government of Paro would sell some of the Avodim, for profit obviously, to these Sorim, to these officers and noblemen of Bnei Yisrael. So not all the Shibud was coming from Mitzrayim. Some of the enslavement was within Klal Yisrael. To me, this was a radical chiddush that I never encountered this.
Rob Berzon?
Yes?
What about Gad, Shevet Gad? They also didn't inherit inside Israel.
That's an excellent question. I mean, if we're going to assume that this was compensation for Reuven because he only got Ever Yarden, so why not compensate Gad? I don't know the answer to that question, but the Medrash clearly singles out these three Shvatim, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi for Srara. Then he goes on to say that therefore, Tziva Hashem Yisborach Shebnei Yisrael v'gam Paro Yotzius Bnei Yisrael me'ashibut. Now it makes sense to say Vayitzavem el Bnei Yisrael. And then you'll see later on in this very section of Parshas Vaeira, the Torah goes through the genealogy of these three Shvatim. And then it ends up by saying, who Aaron and Moshe. And Hashem tells them, Lahotzius Bnei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim al tzivosam. What are the extra words al tzivosam? That now every shevet gets its own tzava. In other words, it becomes a free shevet, independent on its own, meaning lo yishtavu Yisrael zeh lazeh, that within the Shvatim there would never be this higher class that would enslave a lower class. There were no class distinctions. And he bases himself now on a Yerushalmi, that the Yerushalmi asks the question that all the Mefarshim ask, Vayitzavim el Bnei Yisrael, what's the content here? And the Yerushalmi answers, Sheyishluchu Avdeya Yisrael, that this is the mitzvah of Yovel, that once in 50 years, the Jewish people are called upon to free their slaves. Says Rameir Simcha, we can add an extra dimension and explain why this mitzvah of Shiluach Avodim was given exactly at this juncture when Hashem is coming to command Paro to free the Jews. And the answer is because the command is coming not just to Paro, but also to the Jews themselves. And that will express itself during Jewish history down the line in the mitzvah of Shiluach Avodim once every 50 years. By the way, on the side, if I would add a footnote here, the great Rosh Hashiva, the Mir, Rab Chaim Shmulevitz, in his Sichot Musar, has an entire lecture trying to understand this Yerushalmi, why the mitzvah of Shiluach Avodim to free one's slaves is given exactly at this juncture. Beautiful presentation. But Rabbi Simcha is saying it's absolutely appropriate because the Jews at this point in history were actually commanded to free their slaves. But in the next paragraph, Rabbi Simcha wants to understand why it was fit in the divine providence to see to it that these three Shvatim would be Noeg Srora b'Mitzrayim. And he says the following. The Mechilta in Parshas Bo famously says that the Geula of Klal Yisrael was a result of four great merits. They didn't change their names, their language. They weren't involved in Arayos or in Lashon Hara. They were Mitsuyanim. They were outstanding. They were a nation that you could separate and see the difference between that people and the other people. And they consider themselves foreigners in the land of Mitzrayim. Interesting. Why was it that the Jewish people, who were guilty of so many different sins in Mitzrayim, yet they were unique and separate from the Mitzrayim? And that's because they held out faith for the ultimate Geula. Yaakov gave each one of the Shvatim a bracha that he, representing the Shevet, would inherit a portion of the land. And that's the Geula that will take place after Yoshua conquers the land. The people in Israel, each one of the Shvatim, was anxiously waiting for that glorious day when they would be freed from slavery in Mitzrayim. They would conquer the land of Israel, and each Shevet would be granted its portion in the land. But Ilu Hayu Mishubadim, however, although Yaakov Avinu presented this glorious vision of the ultimate Geula, of Kibush Eretz Yisrael, of Chiluk Haaretz, each Shevet getting a Nachla, there were three Shvatim who were not part of that vision of Yaakov Avinu. They weren't blessed to gain portions in Eretz Yisrael. So now the question arises, are they going to be down in the dumps, going through the terrible slavery of 2 centuries plus that would have broken the spirits of anyone? The Jews in general were holding out because of that glorious vision of the brach of Yaakov Avinu, that they would inherit the Nachla, but these three Shvatim were not given that glorious brach of Yaakov Avinu. They had nothing to look forward to. They weren't going to be part of the Nachla of Eretz Yisrael, and that would break their spirits. They would be, so to speak, depressed. And therefore, ilu hayu mishubadim, if they would be enslaved, kechol achem, like the balance of Klal Yisrael, hayu misarvim b'Mitzrayim, they would have ultimately assimilated and not consider themselves gerim. Because why aren't we gerim? We're not gerim because we'll inherit the land. We're not going to get portions in the land of Israel. And they would imagine, they would come to the mistaken conclusion that they are being excluded, so to speak, from Klal Yisrael at the time of the ultimate redemption. It was part of the divine wisdom and providence that these three Shvatim would not be part of the Shibud, because they would be, it would break them. Their spirits would be broken, and they would imagine that we're not going to be part of Klal Yisrael. We don't participate in that glorious vision of the ultimate redemption. We have no portions promised us by Yaakov Avinu in the land. We might as well assimilate with the Goyim and become like the Mitzrayim. The other Jews were like the Mitzrayim in many, many ways, except for four, and they held out as Gerim, seeing themselves as foreigners in the land of Mitzrayim, because they held out for the kiyum of the bracha of Yaakov. So just to summarize, there were really two different amazing chidushim here in this presentation of Rameir Simcha. One, to answer the question, Vayitzavum es Bnei Yisrael, what was the substance of that tzivui, and how is it connected with Shichur Avodim and the mitzvah of Yovel, as the Yerushalmi says? And is it possible that the same tzivui that was given to Paro and Mitzrayim to free the slaves was given to Bnei Yisrael, and based on a medrash that there were three Shvatim that were exempt from the slavery? They were outside of being enslaved. They were Bnei Srara. He presents a thesis that these three Shvatim had purchased Avodim and now were commanded by God to free those Avodim. But the second Chidush, as to why these three Shvatim were granted this gracious, shall we call it, grace from the divine being, that they would not have to be part of the Shibud. Why these three Shvatim? And Rameir Simcha says, because the Shibud would have broken their spirits. They didn't have the blessing of Yaakov. They weren't guaranteed to inherit their own independent portions in the land. And therefore, what would be that inner strength, a source of strength that would give them the stamina and the ability to remain Jews and to anticipate and long for the fulfillment of that great vision? These three Shvatim didn't have that motivation. They didn't have that energy force. And therefore, the slavery and the humiliation of Mitzrayim would have broken them. They would have eventually assimilated together with the Mitzvah. Now, I'd like you to fast forward to, skipping one presentation, to Perek Vav, Psukim, Chavtes, and Lamed. Now, in order to appreciate this Rameir Simcha, we really have to open up a Chumash and flip a little bit backwards, rewind, if you will, to Pasuk Yud Beis. Vaydaber Moshe lifnei Hashem lemor, hein bnei Yisrael lo shamu elai, v'ech yishmaeni paro, v'ani aral sfasai. And this is Moshe's resistance in accepting the position as the Redeemer of Israel. Now, fast forward to Pasuk Chavtes, Pasuk Lamed. Again, Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe, second time around, Ani Hashem, Daber el Paro, Vayomer Moshe, Hein Ani Aral Svasayim, V'ech Yishma Elai Paro. If you take a look at Rashi, Rashi is bothered by this problem. It seems like the Torah is repeating a story twice. And Rashi explains in Pasuk of Tes, and you'll see it again in Pasuk Lamed, that Hu Adibur Atzmo, when it says Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe, go and speak to Paro to free the Jewish people, this is the original Dibur back in Pasuk Yoda Aleph, Bo Daber el Paro. So why is the Torah repeating itself? Says Rashi, V'tok shehifsika inyan kidei liachsam. Since the Torah mentioned Aaron and Moshe, it went through an entire section, a whole unit of psukim, to delineate and enunciate the genealogy of the Shvatim. So there's a hefsek here. So now to pick up the storyline, there had to be a repetition of what we had earlier. Rashi repeats himself in Pasuk Lamed. Vayomer Moshe l'fnei Hashem ha'anochi ani aral svasayim. We already had that in Pasuk Yud Beis. Hi ha'mira shalamala. Hein b'nei Yisrael lo shamu elai. And Amas aral svasayim. Shina kosev kan. The Torah repeated it. Not that Moshe Rabbeinu repeated himself, but the Torah repeated it. Came on shehifsik ha'inyan. V'kein hi ha'shita. This is a literary style. If we got a little bit distracted in the middle of the storyline, so when we get back online, we say, let's go back and repeat what we said earlier. Total repetition. So Rashi is invoking a kind of literary style, if you will. Meir Simcha has another approach, a different approach. First of all, Meir Simcha asks, I don't get it. The pasuk here says, pasuk Chavtes, Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemor ani Hashem. What's ani Hashem doing over here? God has to introduce himself. Secondly, what is Vayomer Moshe in pasuk Lamed lifnei Hashem? Where Simcha challenges us to find such a language anywhere in the Bible, except with regard to Moshe in this very chapter. And again, if we turn back to Pasuk Yud Beis, Vaydaber Moshe lifnei Hashem. What's the emphasis here on lifnei Hashem? Now, Rabbi Simcha wants to analyze the sequence of the psukim. Moshe had argued to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that the people of Israel aren't listening to me. Pasuk Yud Beis. Hein b'nei Yisrael lo shamu elai. V'ech yishmeni paro. Chazal say that this is one of the 40 kal v'chomers that you'll find in Tanakh. If Klal Yisrael won't listen to me, how do you expect Paro to listen to me? And then, after presenting this argument, Moshe Rabbeinu piles up a second argument, and that is, I'm an Arav Svasayim. How do you expect Paro is going to listen to someone who stutters, who stammers? Ha'inyan, sheMoshe Taran Kodem v'Pasuk Yud Beis Hein b'nei Yisrael lo shama elai v'ech yishmeni Paro v'zeh echad me'asara kal v'chomer b'Torah. And if you take a look in the Perushim on the Medrash, it says there are actually 40 kal v'chomers in the Torah, and this is one of them. And then Moshe presents his second argument, Anochi Aral Sfasayim. Says Rabbi Simcha, when Hashem responds to Moshe, Ani Hashem, the Ani Hashem is the pircha on the Kal V'chomer. Why? Because Bnei Yisrael hein balei bechira. The fact that God knows what we're going to choose does not in any way undermine our ability to make a free choice. And that's the Gvura of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that he allows man to make a decision, free choice, even though he knows what man is going to decide. The paradox of Yudiyah Bechira. Aval Paro Melech Mitzrayim. Here we have a pasuk, and the pasuk in Mishlei says, "Leiv Malachim v'Sarim biyad Hashem." In other words, a melech, a king, is denied freedom of choice, and therefore, and he quotes a pasuk in Yeshaya, "Ani Hashem." Your Kal V'chomer is a false Kal V'chomer, because you're right, Klal Yisrael could decide with freedom that they won't listen to you. But Paro doesn't have that choice. He has to listen. Ubevadai biyodi lahatos levavo. God says I can control his decision in any way. Kol masha eretza. Comes along Moshe, and he says, all right, you won the first round. You slugged up my first time. But what about my second time? What point is there? It's an exercise of futility to send me, an Aral Sfasayim, to present to Paro and try to impact on him. You're sending me because you want my ishtadlus to get Paro to send the people. You got the wrong guy for the job. So let's go back to the Chumash. And now we see that after Hashem rejected Moshe Rabbeinu's first argument, and that was in Pasuk Chavtes, Vaydaber Hashem, Ani Hashem, I will control Paro. Then we get to the second argument. Moshe says, but Hein Ani Aral Svasayin, Hey Yishma Elai Paro. And that's the next Pasuk to reject Moshe Rabbeinu's second time. Vayomer Hashem al Moshe Re'ena Sati Le'elkim Le'Faro Nasatich Elkim Le'Faro Aaron Achicha Yed Neviecha. Don't worry, I'm sending you a Meturgamon. And who is the Meturgamon? It's going to be Aaron. So that if you can't influence with your stammering Paro, Aaron will do the job. And therefore, we completely circumvent Rashi's problem as to why the Torah is Kaviyachal repeating itself. And Rashi says because of the hefsek about the genealogy. No. This is not a repetition. What's happening here, which didn't happen above, is HaKadosh Baruch Hu is responding to Moshe's two arguments and rejecting. Pasuk Lamed. Vayomer Moshe Lifnei Hashem. What is the significance here of Lifnei Hashem? And as you'll soon see, Rabbi Simcha claims that you'll never find Lifnei Hashem as a description of man speaking to God. So what's Lifnei Hashem in the case of Moshe Rabbeinu? Says Rabbi Simcha, this is absolutely appropriate to Parshas Vaeira, because Parshas Vaeira in its beginning is all about the difference, the extra mila and madrega of Moshe Rabbeinu above the Amos. The Amos get Kel Shakai, and Moshe Rabbeinu gets Yud Kei Vav Kei. There are two fundamentally different levels of nevuah, as the Rambam outlines it in Hilchos Yisodei HaTorah. One nevuah is called Aspaklaria She'eno Me'ira. It's not a clear-cut vision, but Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah is unique in many different ways, and it achieves Aspaklaria HaMe'ira. Therefore, says Rabbi Simcha, Lifnei Hashem, the word Lifnei means in preparation. It means before. And therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu, in order to reach this madrega of nevuah of Aspaklaria HaMe'ira, he has to prepare himself. That's the Lifnei Hashem. Whenever you have to appear in front of God and reach a higher level, you've got to prepare yourself, and that's the Lifnei Hashem. And therefore, Hichin Moshe Atzmo L'Nevuah, Lenny, I don't want you to miss this point. Okay, Lenny, are you listening? This is a very important point that Moshe Rabbeinu had to prepare himself because he is about to reach that madrega of anavua basmaklaria meira. And Masha'en came b'chal Torah. You'll never find this with any other Navi that he speaks to God lifnei Hashem. That's the darga of Moshe. And now Rabbi Simcha asks the following question: why is it that lifnei Hashem appears twice in this very short unit of psukim here in Perek Vav? It appears the first time in Pasuk Yud Beis Vaydaber Moshe lifnei Hashem, and a second time here in Pasuk Lamed Vayomer Moshe lifnei Hashem. Why twice lifnei Hashem? Brilliant question, but who could even begin to figure it out and an answer? Only Rabbi Simcha. And Rabbi Simcha draws a parallel here to tefillah. Because as we know, after the loss and the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, we don't have nevuah, but we have tefillah as the replacement for nevuah. The Gemara tells us in Masechta Brachos that if a person is called upon to serve as a shliach tzibur, which is a great status and responsibility, then he should refuse twice. Pam Rishona, the Gemara says the first time, misarif. Absolutely not, he says. But Pam Shnia, when they ask him a second time, mahaveh. Rashi says, Ninayer Lamod. He's already preparing himself to go up to the oven. And finally, when they ask him a third time, he shoots out to the oven. And if that be the case, then the derech eretz of a shliach tzibur is to be derived from Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu is being called upon to serve this amazing role. And the first, he says, lifnei Hashem. What is lifnei Hashem? Says Rabbi Simcha that the word lifnei, the phrase lifnei Hashem, means whenever you feel the greatness of somebody or something, you're lifnei, you are overwhelmed by that, by the value and the estimation of, in this case, Moshe standing in front of Hashem. So the first time around, Moshe Rabbeinu refuses. The second time around, Moshe Rabbeinu already knows that he's going to have to take the job, and he's already minayer lotzes, lamo. Therefore, says Rav Meir Simcha, let's take a look at Pasuk Lamed. Pasuk Lamed, Vayomer Moshe lifnei Hashem, hein ani. What is hein ani? Says Rav Meir Simcha, the words hein ani mean mizuman lelech. I will prove to you that whenever it says hein or hineni, it means I'm ready to go. In the first round, before HaKadosh Baruch Hu had upslugged both arguments of Moshe Rabbeinu, there was no hein ani. But now, there's hein ani. Hineni muchan, I'm now ready to move forward and take the job. Rabbi say, let's fast forward now to Perek Zayin, and we'll begin with Pasuk Tes.
I'd like to make one small observation.
Please.
Sorry to interrupt you. Is there any reason why the pasuk is in a different form, in a different order? In pasuk Yud Beis, it's got here it's got Ani Rasa Fasayim, and then Paro won't listen to me. Any reason for that?
In Pasuk Yud Beis, Vani Aral Sfasayim.
It comes afterwards. He says, Paro won't listen to me, Vani Aral Sfasayim. Bnei Yisrael won't listen to me.
Right, Bnei Yisrael won't listen to me. How do you expect Paro to listen?
Then Vani Aral Sfasayim.
Somehow you'll slug me up on that argument, But how can I yet communicate and impress and have an impact on Paro because then I'm an Aral Masai.
So here on the in Pasuk Lamed, it's the other way around. So Anir Al Masai, but Eight Mishmai like Paro.
No, because he's already got the Ani Hashem in the previous Pasuk Chavtes. So once in Pasuk Chavtes he has Ani Hashem, then that's the Pirch on his Kal V'chomer. He's not going to repeat Ve'hein lo, right? Ve'hein lo shavu livech yishmeni Paro. But he repeats his original second argument because although Ani Hashem is a great counter pircha to his Kal V'chomer, the first argument, but he still has his second argument. Okay. And now we're up to Perek Zayin Pasuk Tes. So let's read the pasuk inside. Perek Zayin Pasuk Tes. It says the following: Ki daber lechem paro leimor tnu lachem mofes. You should know that when you show up in front of Paro, he's going to ask for a sign. V'amarta Aaron kaches matcha v'ashlech lifnei Paro yehi l'sanim. Rabbi Simcha builds mountains on the one word Yehi. What bothers Rabbi Simcha about the word Yehi? And actually, I found this kasha in the Balaturim. It should have said Vayehi Lisanin or Viyehi Lisanin. In other words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is telling Moshe that when Aaron will throw the matter in front of Paro, it will become a tanin. In Hebrew grammar, it should have been viahi, and it will turn into a snake. Is everybody following me on that? Because again, this whole presentation is based on the absence of one letter, namely the vav of vayahi l'tanin. And just to give you a taste of the Balaturim, he says that Aaron was actually going to give that command to the staff later on, but he threw it down now, and this was like almost an experiment, if I understand the Balaturim correctly. And the whole point of this os that's going to be done and performed in front of Paro is to prove to Paro that he's not the boss, that there's a God who created nature and he is above nature. Nature will bow to his will, his with a capital H. And it's very fascinating. If you get a chance to look at the Balaturim, he tries to explain why Paro calls himself, why the os is that the staff should turn into a snake, and that's because Paro himself refers to himself as the snake, or I don't know if it's a snake, maybe it's a crocodile, whatever it is that is the largest ruling creature in the sea, in the Nile River. And Hashem is saying to him that ultimately a staff is lifeless. It's carbon. It has no life to it. And just like you think, Paro, you're in charge of the Nile, right? You're the king of the Nile. So too, Hashem says, I'm going to turn you back into a stick. Just like this snake will be turned back into a stick. And the language here is Yachzor Lios Afar V'Rima V'Toleha. That Paro, you should know, you're going to become Afar. You're going to become something that is absolutely lifeless. Rabbi Simcha, on the other hand, has a totally different answer to the question of the Balaturim about the absence of the vav. Now, in order to appreciate Rameir Simcha's Chiddush, we'll mention a Gemara that Rameir Simcha alludes to, but he doesn't quote the whole Gemara. It's a Gemara in Shabbos on Daf Sadi Zayin. The Gemara describes a pasuk later on when Moshe and Aaron actually show up in front of Paro. Vayashlichu ish mateu, vayu lisaninim, and then it says vayivla mate Aaron es matosam. So you remember the Chartume Paro? They also had the same magic, and they turned the stick into the staffs into snakes, and then Aaron's mate swallows up all of their staffs. So the Gemara quotes Rabbi Loza. Rabbi Loza says, Zeh nes b'toch nes, which literally means a miracle inside a miracle. So what's this nes b'toch nes? So first, I always like to tell you what Rashi says, so that we'll appreciate where Meir Simcha is coming from. And Rashi explains that after Aaron's snake, the tanin, became a staff again, that was miracle number one. Then he says Aaron's staff swallowed up all the other staffs, and that's miracle number two. So the Marsha already is very upset with this Rashi, because that's not nes b'tok nes. You want to say that these were two different nisim. Nes number one, that a staff could become a snake, and number two, that it could go back to become a snake, a staff again. And it could swallow up all the other staffs. I mean, the Marsha wants to argue that nes b'toch nes means that there's a nes inside of a nes. Call it a nes liachar nes, but not a nes b'toch nes. So the Marsha explains that what happens is that Aaron's staff swallows up all the snakes, while Aaron's snake swallows up all the other snakes, and then it reverts back to being a staff, and there's no indication that the staff has changed. It's the same exact staff as the one that he held before he threw it down, and it turned into a snake. You know, you would have expected that if one snake swallows up all the other snakes, you know, you would see, you know, the expanded belly. So that's the nes b'toch nes. Says Rameir Simcha, shebe'es Amar Hashem sheyeh l'tanin, which means literally that God is saying now, before Moshe and Aaron go to Paro, that your staff will become a snake, which means in Lashon Asid in the future. And therefore it should say, Vi Yehi, or Vi Yiyeh. What is Yehi Litanin? What is Yehi Litanin? So when you hear the word Yehi, you automatically associate it with the first Yehi in Tanakh, when Hashem declares Yehi Ar. He says, what Hashem is saying here is V'yeh bo koach brias tanin. Hashem is declaring that right now, when you're holding a staff, that staff is endowed with a supernatural power to become a snake. The potential is already now. God is already creating in the staff, the power to become a snake in the future. Yehi tanin. Now it's a tanin. Not physically, but in potential. Ubimamoro Yisbarach Shmo Nishave Zeka Ace. Everything that's created is created with the Mamar of Hashem. Asar Mamaros Nivra Olam. So this Mamar Yehi Litanin already creates the Tanin in the snake. Nishave Zeka Ace Bi'esha Omro Lemoshe. And already now, the snake is endowed with this power to become a Tanin. Ulakach, af bi-odo mater, bola matoso. He says the following. What does Rabbi Elazar mean in Masechta Shabbos when he says it's a nes b'toch nes? He means that already, when it was still a matter, it already was swallowing up all of their staffs. Meaning that God, when he said Yehi L'Tanin, created two supernatural powers in this staff. B'mamaro. Number one, the ability of the staff to become a Tanin. And number two, the ability of the staff to swallow up all the other matos of the Khartume Paro. That's the Nes B'toch Nes. A double potential that was already injected into the Mata from the moment that Hashem declared the words Yehi Litanin. So therefore, the Pasuk is telling Moshe and Aaron that right now I'm giving the stick this trait of a snake, which will be manifested later when you get in front of Paro and the Khartume Paro, and it will swallow the other staffs. Unbelievable. Whole new pshat in Nes B'toch Nes, and a whole new perspective on the absence of the Vav. Okay. Let's move on in this chapter Zion to the very next paragraph in Reb Meir Simcha. That's Pasuk Chaf Tes. Now, my wife tells me that the internet is back up, so let me take a break for a second, and it'll be a lot easier for me to do it from there instead of I'm holding on to these svarim on my lap and so forth. So that what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put this on mute. Question, can you hear me? Yes?
Right. Yes, I can hear
All
you.
right.
Yes, I
Okay.
can.
All right. Thanks. I'm back home, so to speak. Okay. So we're looking at Perek Zion Pasuk Chav Beis, and we'll see. Okay. Pasuk says the following: Perek Zion Pasuk Chav Beis, Vayasuchem Chartumei Mitzrayim Bilotehem. Read the English translation here of Pasuk 22. Okay, so he says that the Chartumei Paro did likewise with their secret rites. That's how he translates Bilotehem. Now, what's the status of Kishuv or Shedim with regard to Bnei Noach? And you may recall that in the past, we've discussed the issue of Bnei Noach in the context of the Meshech Chochma, and with special emphasis on Lifnei Iver. He says, Elu Maseh Shedim Bilotehem Elu Maseh Shafim. So there are two words that are very similar. One appears early in Pasuk Yud Aleph, and there it says Bilat Lahatehem, where there's a hey after the lamed, and here in Pasuk of Beis Bilatehem, without the hey. The first pasuk refers to Kshafim, and the second to Shedim. This is all based on a sugya, and I got it in Masechta Sanhedrin in Perek Chelek. Vinira, lahanach tanoi desvire de bnei Noach nitztabel akishuv. This is the shita of Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yossi in Sanhedrin Daf Nun Vav on base, the famous sugya of bnei Noach, of mitzvahs bnei Noach, and they are of the opinion that when bnei Noach are commanded or enjoined from any involvement in kishuv, he says, Asi Shapi. Now, I understand something. Back in Pasuk Yud Aleph, the Mata turned into a Tanin. Asa Hashem Yisbarach Mofes, Asher Yuchlu HaMitzrayim Lasos Al Yedei Kishuv. What happens is that on the first round, which we said was Maisek Shafim, was Kishuv, HaKadosh Baruch Hu did a miracle such that one that could be imitated and duplicated by the Mitzrayim through Kishuv. Okay. And Rameir Simcha says, the Akati ein mishum lifnei iver. In other words, that when you entice someone else to violate the law, that's a problem of lifnei iver. But if that person is granted freedom of choice, again, we're not going into all the details of lifnei iver, but theoretically, or fundamentally, there's no lifnei iver, because that person was not coerced, but rather has freedom of choice. Ubedam ubetzfardea osa Hashem yisbarach dvarim shelo yuchlu lasel seyedei kishuv. However, there's certain changes in nature that.
Rabbi Berzon, you've got on. Rabbi Berzon, you've got on to mute. I can't hear you.
How's it now? Okay.
Better. Yeah, better.
Again, there are certain achievements that require what's called shadim and cannot be achieved by man through sorcery. For example, dam and sfardeya. So when HaKadosh Baruch Hu implements these miracles of dam and sfardeya, this is something that cannot be duplicated by the mechashvim through kishuv. Rak al yedei masa shedim, and then again, this is our pasuk here, pasuk Chav Beis, which is bilateim masa shedim. Lachein lo kara lemachashvim rak lechartumim. The al yedei masa shedim, the al masa shedim lo huzru b'nei Noach v'ein kan mishum lifnei iver. Now, the only thing that I'm missing here, just give me 1 second. I'll tell you what's bothering me about this Reb Meir Simcha. He's trying to explain the difference between Bilhateihem and Bilateihem. And Bilateihem with a hey, which is the earlier pasuk, that's referring to Meshech Shafim. And there's no lifnei iver, because if Hashem performs these miracles of dam and sfardeya, they don't have the ability to imitate this with Meshech Shafim. Here, on the second round, we're talking about Meshech Shedim. So in the first round, Pam Rishona, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu, just 1 second, Os Hashem Yisbarach Mofes. So let's go slow. So Hashem turns the mata of Aaron into a snake. That's something that the Mitzrayim could do with Kishuv. Correct? So Akati ein mishum lifnei iver. Oh, those are the 4 words I'm trying to. Ein mishum lifnei iver. I'm missing that one point. Anybody have that point? Why is there no lifnei iver in this case? He says that's b'pam rishona, when the Mitzrayim were able to imitate the miraculous divine miracle of transforming the mata into a tanin, and that's something that the Mitzrayim, were able to accomplish and imitate by virtue of use with kishuv. And that's Bil HaTehe, back in Pasuk Yud Aleph, with a hey. But now we're up to Dam and Sfardeya, and this is something that cannot be achieved by the sorcerers through Kishuv. It can only be achieved through Maisa Shedim, and that's called Bilatehen. And that's where Paro calls in the Khartoumim, because it's the Khartoumim and not the Mechashvim who could possibly imitate this by utilizing the power of Shedim. Now, Rabbi Simcha again asked the question, what about Lifnei Iver?
aren't we in a sense enticing the Chartumim to utilize the power of the Shedim in order to imitate this amazing miracle of Dam and Svardeya? Nay, why not? Called Al Maisa Shedim Lo Huzaru B'nei Noach. The Ein Kan Mishum Liftei Iver. Evan Shahayabari Sheyikra Lasos Kimoso Have Liftei Iver. In other words, it was crystal clear that they would be called upon to try to imitate God's miracle, and therefore it would be Liftei Iver, but since they could not imitate it by using Kishuv, but only by using Shedim, and B'nei Noach Lo Nizaru, they were not enjoined from using Maisa Shedim, therefore there's no Liftei Iver. But what I don't understand is the Pama Rishona, if anyone could fill me in on this point, Rabbi Simcha insists that that's not called Liftei Iver, even though that was a Maisa Kishuv to transform the staff into a snake. So that's what I'm missing here. Let me just see for a moment. I don't want to keep you because I see it's getting late, but I just want to see if by chance there is a footnote here that might just explain that one point. And if not, I'll have to owe it to you. Where are we? Zion Chaf Beis, right? So I have here no, I don't see a footnote on this. Let me just see. Achri sharosh kachasa paro b'mikra rishon shalamat lamrota isal kishav az amnullah muchrach lasos kemaisa HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But ilu HaKadosh Baruch Hu osa mofes shenita levatzal yidei basav v'dam akbar tos kishuv. Pam Rishona, he says the following. The Pam Rishona ein isa lifnei iver ki b'chiraso lo laso sapula. That removes lifnei iver. But in the second pula, now already there would be lifnei iver. Why? Ila Kashbach osa mofa shenital vatzrak alidei basa v'dam akvim sos kishuv is then there would be lifnei iver. Oh, I see. I got it. He's saying like this. In the first round, there's lifnei iver because they were just enticed to imitate Hashem. And the reason why there's no lifnei iver is because they had bechira chavshus. But if on the second round, HaKadosh Baruch Hu again is doing a miracle, now they're already almost compelled to imitate that miracle, and that would be lifnei iver. But why is there no lifnei iver? Because a ben Noach is not enjoined from Shedim, the Chartumim. He's only enjoined from Kisha. So in both cases, there's no lifnei iver when Hashem does these miracles in front of the Chartumim. In the first case, there's no lifnei iver because, as Rabbi Simcha says, they had freedom of choice. They could decide, and the fact that God knew in advance that they would decide to use Kishuv, that doesn't force them to do Kishuv. Like we said many times, Yediyah of Hashem does not force Bechira. So that's their own decision, and that's not lifnei iver. In the second round already, now it's almost like they're mukhrach. They're almost forced to do the Ma'asav HaKadosh Baruch Hu and to live up to what Hashem did and somehow neutralize the dam and its fardeh and so forth. So now it should be lifnei iver, but it's not lifnei iver because now it's bilateyem. It's a Ma'aser Shedim, and B'nai Noach are not mitzvah on Ma'aser Shedim. Okay, then, so this is where we're going to stop. And we covered a lot of different inyanim today. And I'll wish you all a great Shabbos. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Shabbat shalom.